Welcome to Theology, Imagination and the Arts with me, your host, Daniel Côté Davis. On today's show, we have Lady Clare Asquith, Countess of Oxford, and Asquith. Welcome, Lady Clare. It is wonderful to have you with us today.
It's a great pleasure for me. Thank you, Dan, for asking me.
At the beginning of your book, Shadowplay, you detail an anecdote of being in Moscow under communism and watching a Chekhov play. Within this experience, you became aware of a subtle subtext of meaning that the KGB guards missed, but the audience knew all too well. It was, in fact, a political drama which was a vehicle of social commentary within a repressive regime. How did this experience sow the seeds of your books, Shadowplay?
Well, I was in Moscow in the 1980s, and my husband was in the embassy there. And it was my first experience of living under a repressive totalitarian regime, which most of us, thank God, don't. But it's a very, very intense experience if you do. And if you're looking at the possibility of coded drama, it just isn't there unless you know the context, and unless the context is extremely intense. So in this case, it was fear and repression. And my husband and I were tipped off about certain small, hidden, secret performances, which of course the KGB got to know were happening. We were asked along. It seemed to be an innocuous play. In fact, it was about political events. And I found that such an extraordinary relief, even as a diplomat. It was scary being there, and diplomats had to get out just to breathe fresh air in Scandinavia every now and again. And so that experience is what set off my book. Context is everything for coded drama. We had a Ukrainian here just last week, and he described a play in Kiev where a Shevchenko play, Shevchenko is their great playwright, the curtain went up in Kiev 3 weeks ago, and there was just a Ukrainian village set and Ukrainian villagers, and all the audience were immediately in tears, not a word said. Now, when we lived in Kiev, that wouldn't have been the case. So that's to show that context is everything, and once you have the context, the possibility of another meaning, a contemporary meaning, is immediately there.
So this double language and hidden identity in Russian dissident writing clearly contributed to your understanding of a project of resistance to the overhaul of culture. How did these techniques influence your reading of Shakespeare? Why did you come to conclude that he was a Catholic dissident, firmly on the side of defending the Catholic Church from the onslaught of the Reformation, and not just some acclaimed humanist writer who was unconcerned with the Anglican compromise?
Well, it's a bit of a jump, isn't it, from watching those plays in Moscow in the 80s and then saying Shakespeare was doing the same thing. And particularly a jump for you and me and most people, my generation anyway, who were brought up to think everything was fine in the Elizabethan and Jacobean era, that there was the smooth transition from the Middle Ages through Renaissance, Reformation to Enlightenment, and that England accepted the Reformation. So the context was a basically contented country, going through a bit of an upheaval with some dissidents, but there's no real need to look for a second meaning. And I remember reading when I was at Oxford doing English literature about drama in the 16th century, and I remember reading Christopher Ricks actually writing about secondary meanings, political meanings, an undercurrent of this, a hint of the Armada there, etc. And it just bored me because the politics was boring. It was uncontentious, uncontroversial. So no point connecting it really with my reading of the great universal Shakespeare. However, when I came back from a second stint, not in Russia, but in Ukraine, and I got a second take of a totalitarian regime, because in Ukraine, independence had just come in and people could talk about what it had been like. So I was pretty much immersed in that experience. And I got into a weird argument with a friend about whether or not Shakespeare was a Catholic. totally separate thing. So he's a sort of wonderful writer and an Anglican and an anti-Catholic in the most entertaining way. So we got into this long email correspondence, which I had to research more and more. And in the end, number one, I found that a deep dive into 16th century recusant history and literature actually produced the same repressive, totalitarian atmosphere of terror that I knew all about from the Soviet Union. So, to my surprise, the context was totally different. And I began to read, I thought, not Shakespeare. I read Shakespeare's contemporaries thinking, are they playing the same game? Are they using certain common counters, words that everyone understands means KGB, means the West, means foreign currency? Do they have these counters? And I found that, yes, they did. And I can go into it perhaps a bit later. Some of them, Spencer, for instance, played that game very badly and suffered for it. And if you look at nearly all Shakespeare's contemporaries, they nearly all suffered for it in some way. But Shakespeare, he seemed above it all until I had a really good look at him. And to my amazement, I saw, and I wasn't the first, that he was playing the same game, but doing it in such a sophisticated way that he never got caught. He played it so that everybody knew he was playing it. He played it within the rules, so Queen Elizabeth knew what he was writing. So I was so thrilled with that already the person I was in an argument with said, go away and write a book. That's enough email. But that was the start.
Yes, and just to respond to that, I always was amazed the first time I saw the map of England under the Reformation of here are dissolved monasteries, and you couldn't see any land. Yeah. You couldn't see any land. The points that showed the dissolved monasteries covered the whole land. It's absolutely impossible to say that this was not an unfathomable evil that everybody knew they were swimming in. And to use a modern term, gaslighting. Yeah. Gaslighting is where someone tells you something that isn't true and you have to believe it, and it humiliates you. Because I've heard that that's a subordination technique that the communists use, was if you can get people to believe a lie, then you have control of their soul.
Yes.
It humiliates them, it degrades them, and they lose their dignity.
I mean, the monasteries are a complicated thing. I won't go there too much. It was a sixth of England, a sixth of the...
Yeah.
A huge amount. But of course, an awful lot of people were in the conflicted zone that Shakespeare addresses. They were in conflict. They bought into that. Loads of people got rich through the monasteries. And so with one hand in the till, but their foot in the old religion, they were... So that's what he was addressing.
And so that links to my next question about the status of the recusants, the penal laws, and the Phoenix movement in Shakespeare's generation. Is it true that Shakespeare's father had been recently proven to have had one of Campion's tracts in his possession? Also, there is the claim that his daughter once refused to go to a Protestant service. So can you bring that all together for us, the Phoenix movement, the tract, and his daughter?
I looked up the Phoenix movement. I don't know what it is, Dan, actually. Someone called Robin Chester, towards the end of the 16th century, put together an anthology of books that seem to address, poems that seem to address martyrdom, and Shakespeare's is one of them. So the Phoenix roughly seems, at least in that book, to correlate with martyrdom. But the recusant laws they begin as soon as Elizabeth comes to the throne with the oath of supremacy. If you refuse to take the oath, there are stringent penalties. And the last one is treachery. If you refuse to take the oath 3 times, you lose your money, you lose your estate, you go to prison, and finally it could be execution. So from the beginning, the penalties for not stepping up and at least lip service, accepting the new regime, were pretty extreme. And it wasn't implemented to start with that much, but it was in certain situations. So recusant laws were increasingly invasive. They've been made light of by historians until about 50 years ago. But in fact, they had to build new prisons to contain all the recusants, the Catholics who refused to go to church. A far, far bigger proportion, however, looked at the recusant laws, thought they weren't going to go there, and conformed superficially. And again, going back to the conflicted feeling, you've bought an abbey, but you like the old religion. Here again, you want to be an MP, but you have to take the oath. You want to be a JP, and you have to take the oath. Your standing in the country suggests you should do these things in the county. What do you do? Do you take the oath or not? Do you denounce the Pope, which is what the oath of supremacy does, or not? And a lot of people did. Most of us would. We wouldn't have the nerve to stand up against it. But there were wonderful people. I mean, Lady Cicely Stoner in the 1580s, I think, very old woman. She chose to go to prison, grand old lady, rather than give up practice of the Mass. So it was a totalitarian regime. It was frightening for a lot of people, and the recusant laws were increasingly invasive.
So Campion, within that, they found attractive Campions in his father's house, Shakespeare's father's house.
It was a testament by Charles Borromeo, which Campion disseminated. They think, even that isn't clear that he did, but it was a tick-the-box form which said, in the event of my death, this is the patron saint to whom I want to consign my spirit. I'm a Catholic, etc., and my name is. And this document was found in the Shakespeare family, in the roof of the Shakespeare family house, with John Shakespeare signature at the bottom, his father. And it was found in the 18th century and given to Edmund Malone, who was the great Shakespeare scholar of the day, who, after a couple of doubts, accepted it. It's been disputed since, is it genuine or not? But it looks as if it is. It's vanished.
And his daughter was refusing to go to the Protestant services.
Out in 1606, that's the year after the Gunpowder Plot, when there was a crackdown. And they went round everybody. They found she was one of the people who would not go to church. They didn't follow the case up. It shows that either there were a lot more people refusing to go to church than we think, or that they didn't think she was it was worth pursuing her for some reason. But it's true, a lot of people did not go to church and got away with it. They didn't have the capability of actually forcing people to go. And Nicholas Bacon, the what was he, senior in the Privy Council, said, "Why is it the common people no longer go to church or to the Common Prayer, the Book of Common?" So I think there was a hanging back.
It strikes me as very unfortunate, the Gunpowder Plot and also the Spanish Armada, because it was violence rather than evangelization. It wasn't a peaceful method, and it sort of cemented in the English consciousness that Catholicism was a foreign power against the monarchy, and it really undermined any attempts to show that Catholicism really was the nascent, latent religion that infused all of culture and civilization. And we still have Christmas and Easter, so it's very, very profoundly linked. We're here in Walsingham today, but it was most unfortunate, I think. It
was very unlucky. Shakespeare wrote quite differently after the Gunpowder Plot. He changed the way he wrote.
It's a terrible shame. So Shakespeare's plays were formed in the tumultuous cauldron of the Reformation. It's hard to fathom just how traumatic these events were in England's history, a violent break that was both sacrilegious in its intent and spread by coercion and persecution. One in which Catholics were existentially torn between loyalty to the Pope and taking the oath of supremacy to the English monarch. Why is it important to read Shakespeare specifically on the backdrop of this 16th century England?
Well, I mean, people have not done this for hundreds of years. They've read Shakespeare out of any kind of historical context, and he remains the greatest writer ever in most people's opinion. So on that level, it's not important. Shakespeare will remain Shakespeare, whether you read him in context or not. But let's suppose you do read him in my reading of the context. Let's suppose you accept the enormous ask of believing that Shakespeare's writing, as we know he writes, and on a secondary level is addressing the biggest upheaval, the biggest moral and psychological and spiritual challenge that the country's ever faced. And that he's addressing people who are in extremely complicated positions in this situation. So, if you do accept that he's writing on this double level, then you get an immeasurably deeper Shakespeare. I'll give you an example. I was just looking just now at the Winter's Tale, Perdita. There are some beautiful speeches that Florizel makes addressing Perdita. A mystical one where he says, "I wish you were a wave of the sea. Just everything that you do makes what you do more beautiful." If you accept, and you've been reading Shakespeare all the way through, as I believe he should be read, with this secondary level, you see the shadow identity of Perdita as the new reborn English Catholic, if you like, identity, very English. And you see the mystical element of this Catholic identity in its beauty. So it's not just a character, it's more than that. It's a spiritual dimension.
So you try and open this up with the powerful phrase, England's crisis was Shakespeare's passion. Why is a crisis an apt word for describing the spirit of the times, but more specifically, why would it be Shakespeare's passion?
Well, start with why is it a crisis? We can see why a top-down change of culture is being enforced, which is a huge thing, to change culture from above. And often artistic historians are better than literary ones. Andrew Graham Dixon describes the extraordinary change in English art during this period, where it lost its native roots. So we were losing our native roots. So there was that crisis of identity, but there was another crisis. The crisis of identity, I think, might be his passion, but his profession was the political crisis, because there was a great hope, which my second book, Shakespeare and the Resistance, explores. There was hope for the future for Catholics and for dissidents, people who disliked what was going on. And that was the Earl of Essex, who's always been written out as a lightweight figure. But the latest scholarship has him as a serious, enlightened promoter of religious toleration. And it's always been noticed that Shakespeare must be of the Essex party. He favours Essex in his work. He even pretty much mentions him. So a lot of his work in the 1590s, the first half of his work, is intended to promote the Essex party. Essex and Southampton knew what he was doing, and I think sponsored him.
And it's strange, because curious as well, that crisis, the etymology of crisis is belief, credo. So it really was a belief identity crisis, strictly in the etymology of the word. So in Shakespeare's times, all theatrical plays had to be devoid of any hint of treason, on the pain of death. You argue that Shakespeare as a bard innovates therein with a shadowed language that functions on a dual level, that once grasped can be compared to the discovery of a hidden optical illusion, this gifting a new perspective on familiar masterpieces. So what exactly do you mean by shadowplay?
He didn't invent it. It was already there. And it was there in the shadowplay, the double meaning, in the mystery plays. So Pilate in the mystery plays could be a local JP. But of course, that was when there was no if you like, the context was relatively peaceful before the Reformation. After the Reformation, amateur drama was banned, the mystery plays were banned, and any mention of poetry, of politics and religion got you into trouble. And immediately, overnight, a hidden language sprang up. Everybody used it. You had to use it, even if you were supporting the regime, because you would be breaking the law if you mentioned the Prayer Book Rebellion, for instance. So he didn't invent it, but he deployed it. He used it. He picked it up from people like Baldwin, who was a Puritan, a Protestant, who wrote The Mirror of Magistrates. But he refined it. He was the past master.
So you argue that Shakespeare does this by using binary terms that would speak directly to the audience of oppressed Catholics who could actually understand the coded language. For example, Shakespeare's juxtaposition of low and high. What did he mean by these terms?
Yes, if it hadn't been for the precision with which he used what I perhaps shouldn't have called the code, a code. But unlike other people who tried to use a hidden language without Shakespeare's very clever device of using certain words so that gradually his viewers and readers would know what he was referring to when he used high and low or fair and dark. I mean, other people really got into trouble. So Edmund Spenser wrote something called a satire on Lord Burleigh and the Queen, called Mother Hubbard's Tale, and he was exiled for it to Ireland and had to write the Fairy Queen to try and get back. And you can see how clumsy Spenser was compared with Shakespeare, who came after Spenser, and came after a whole lot of writers who were trying to use a hidden language, to the extent to which one scholar said 16th century literature in England was an attempt to find a way around censorship. So given that he didn't start it, he came towards the end, he became absolutely expert in it. And he's the one person you can get a crystal clear image of what he was saying underneath the universal play, because he was so accurate. So high and low and fair and dark. The high and low, he simply took, he's very a man who likes the ordinary man. He took the ordinary everyday phrase, high church, low church, which was current then.
Yes, right.
And high altar and low altar and so on. And that simply divided things into the old and the new. So that was high and low. There's a whole raft of other simple pointers that he would use. In case you're lost at the beginning of the play, where are we? He had all kinds of clever ways, but that was the simplest. So he'll have one...
And dark and fair?
They almost go together. He has 6, dark and fair the same, because dark and fair, the dark obviously is the Puritan print, the Puritan preference for wearing black in church without vestments. And fair,
I see.
the whore of Babylon, the painted lady wearing red and red letters, and so on. So again, that was in common parlance. And Donne and Herbert later used exactly those markers, but in the open. So Herbert openly talks about her in the valleys and her on the hills, meaning Rome and Geneva. So those are, just to go to the fair and dark, he has 6 couples in his plays, women, one of whom is fair and one is dark. And you can probably think of them, but among them are, let me just think, well, the simplest is the first, The Taming of the Shrew, where you've got Catherine, Kate, and Bianca. So Bianca means white.
White, yeah.
Hermia and Helena in the Midsummer Night's Dream. Again, one is dark and one is fair, and huge game develops in Midsummer Night's Dream between these 2 women who are jealous of each other. One because the other one is too tall, the other is too small. Now those 6 couples have puzzled Shakespeare scholars, and they've assumed he had 2 actors, boys, one of them tall, one of them low, one of them fair, one of them dark, and that he wrote those plays with those boys in mind. It shows how odd it is.
Right.
Of course, it's not likely. What is likely is he using them, which he does in these plays, just to give you an idea of of where Beatrice is and where Hero is. Hero, darker, is on the Puritan side, and Beatrice on the Catholic side. Just to pause there, very importantly, Shakespeare's message, what was it? It was that these two sisters were the two sides of the pre-Reformation Christian identity. They were a double cherry seeming party. A cherry that looks like two, in fact it's one. And this organic unity is destroyed by the tempest of the Reformation. He is showing everybody, the monarchs down to the humblest person in the globe, ways that this rift can be mended. And we can think now, when we see the Catholic Church divided, are there ways the two sides can come together? Or Christianity divided, how can it come together? That is the gist of his work. He's not promoting Catholic against what he sees often as admirable Puritan instincts.
He acted in his own plays, didn't he?
He was a very good actor, according to John Aubrey.
Yeah.
Well-made man and a very good actor, not like Ben Jonson, who was an actor and not a very good one. He acted in...
What percentage of his plays do you think he acted in?
We don't have any playlists, so we don't know.
No, yeah. I'll never forget being at the Globe, and it was pouring down with rain, and I was standing, and they had to come out and say, "'Tis a fair evening in Verona." So you know how it's very spontaneous, and so they said it in such an ironic way, and it was absolutely hilarious, because also the cheap seats, a lot of puns there as well, to keep entertaining everyone from every strata of society, and just reaching them in an indirect way. It's so intelligent.
Yes.
So let's talk about the most recent academic literature, which has actually started to highlight the reticence of normal English folk to the Reformed religion. That, in fact, annihilated all they held sacred.
Yep.
Be it the saints, Marian shrines, the consecrated host, and a vibrant sense of Catholic faith, imbibing all aspects of social life, which you note for the majority were so used to by people that they may even have been fun. The revisionist historian Eamon Duffy stands out in this regard and continues a tradition of historical interpretation arguably upheld by Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton. You have noted that this wariness to adopt the violently imposed Protestant services could be known as the silence of John Nobody. What do you mean by this, and how prevalent was this attitude of hesitance? Indeed, this line of argument was made impossible until recently, as history had been written by the winners and not the losers.
Yeah. John Nobody. Well, I think I haven't changed my mind about him. But since Shadowplay, the second book, Shakespeare and the Resistance, follows a great work of Shakespeare's that we can't read now, unless you take my view, and you really use the nutcracker to crack that poem that no one can make any sense of. And he too addresses this mystery which historians have always addressed. Why is it that England lay down under the Reformation so quickly, so easily? Was it just the enormous carrot of the monastic windfall? Was that it? Why was it, or was the old religion simply something nobody really cared about? And you're right, revisionist historians have brought up the richness and wealth of the Reformation right up, so of the church right up to the eve of the Reformation. So why did they lie down? That's a hugely complex question, because the real martyrdoms, the real resistance, began much too late. Campion and Persons began the Jesuit mission in 1581. And then there was a demand to stand up and be counted. So you couldn't really be John Nobody anymore. You had to choose. And Rape of Lucrece shows in wonderful detail the English psychology at that point, the agony of choice, the despair, really, at the death of what Shakespeare saw as spiritual England. The division, the permanent division between the two sisters, They were never going to come together. He describes it as two streams of blood coming from a corpse. The corpse of Lucrece, who's killed herself too late, is a late sacked island. And the blood that comes from this island is black and red, fair and dark. It won't ever come together. So it's like to Hamlet. It is a tragedy. Then.
Yeah, right. It strikes me particularly with Hamlet that Ophelia sings the Walsingham Pilgrimage song, collects Marian flowers, and then shockingly and ambiguously drowns herself as a kind of, not as sort of as the Anglican Church, I guess. That would be the image there. And as a result, you also have the play starting with an ambiguous relationship with your ancestors. You don't have an exorcist to know if it's Satan or the Holy Spirit. It causes chaos. You have a usurper king who is unfaithful, like John the Baptist, which was what the Franciscans, like John the Baptist would say to Herod. You have all that subtext, and it just seems to me that Hamlet is one of the really clear ones.
Yes, well, it's clear about ambiguity, of course. I mean,
right,
and it's very much addressing the Essex circle on the eve of the rebellion. It's addressing all their anxieties. There is no real answer as to what to do.
So you note that it is quite likely that Shakespeare actually, as a child, could have met the Jesuit celebrity Edmund Campion, his Jesuit brother Robert Parsons, and also Robert Southwell. How could this have come about, and why might it be significant to the forming of Shakespeare's mind? Was it not the case that the Jesuits promoted theatre as a means of evangelization?
Yeah. When I wrote Shadowplay, this was a big thing, a big deal. Horton Tower in Yorkshire, or Lancashire rather, was a possible place where Shakespeare, as a very young man, might have gone and might have worked. And Alexander Horton, who ran Horton Tower, was a Catholic. He mentions a will shake shaft in his will. And a huge sort of movement grew up around this, that this was the missing link that connected Shakespeare with Catholicism. And if that had been true, he would have definitely met Campion and Parsons, because they went there. And I checked in Shadowplay, I did say that, but I now don't think it matters whether that happened or not. I don't know whether it did. There's absolutely no proof. And he doesn't address, he does in one of his plays address the Campion affair. But
which one?
Romeo and Juliet.
I'm coming up to that, so we'll get there.
He treats it as a very dangerous thing that you can't. He does, Southwell, move to Robert Southwell, who I think is much, much more influential on Shakespeare than almost anyone as a writer and possibly as a man. I've just seen Lear, King Lear, at the Almeida Theatre, and it's the best production I've ever seen. It's so good that the secondary level is as clear as the primary level. But in that play, Edgar, the story of the Edgar and Edmund and Gloucester, follows the Jesuit mission. It's a cameo of the Jesuit mission, using a lot of the language and experience of Robert Southwell and other Jesuits, but Southwell, mainly referencing Southwell. And with Edgar, you have a picture of the underground priest quite close up. I think he probably did know Southwell.
I mean, everyone knew who Campion was. I mean, he was the most famous person. He was a darling of Elizabeth's court. He'd gone into exile. He'd come back. There were 13 Jesuits running the whole show. I mean, people knew who Campion was and what he believed and what he was trying to achieve.
He would have known him. There were only two in England when...
Oh, right. He was one of the first.
And there was great resentment at the idea they might be running it by the seminary priests, who there was a rift between them and the Jesuits. Yes, he would certainly...
The Jesuits have been known to have rifts.
Yes. Campion was his death, and what was done to him was international scandal. So...
Oh, unbelievable, yeah. Like Thomas More, to be honest, of the same...
as well. So, yes, you would have known that. But at the end, you mentioned Jesuit drama. Southwell is dismissive about plays. And I think he was thinking of playhouses in England. which were very different from Jesuit drama abroad, which happened in magnificent theatres, wonderful settings, no expense spared on scenery and so on. But everything about them makes me think Shakespeare very probably went abroad, learned a bit of his trade through the Jesuits and their use of drama, because everything about Shakespeare's plays, down to the fact that it's written by an actor, the Jesuits said actors had to write the plays, coincides with the way Jesuits recommended you write. So he seems to be obeying the Jesuit blueprint of how to write a play, how to use it to move people, never to be negative about the opposition, to use low and high life. It makes me think that's the one thing makes me think he had a connection.
I think somewhere in the book you mentioned that there was a pun about Moore.
Yes, it's in a sonnet 23. That Moore. I've got it here. He does and he wrote the Thomas More play. Of course, it's something called the Thomas More play, which Shakespeare had a hand in. In fact, it's the only example of his handwriting. Is the page he wrote.
I'm not familiar with that. What is that?
Play. It was written with other playwrights, Anthony McBeth and others, and it never, the censor got hold of it and banned it. Shakespeare was asked to rewrite a bit of it. But more than that love which more hath more expressed. He says, I plead for love and look for recompense, more than that love which more hath more expressed.
Well, links very good to my next question, because it's, can you give us a sense of the creative landscape of the time of Shakespeare's writing? I believe you note an interrelationship between stage censorship, which had arrived in England for the first time, and a popular yet undercover game of witty concealment.
I think this goes back to Annabel Patterson saying literature was a way around censorship. An example of a little school of witty dodges around censorship. It's a series of poems written by all the boys at the time called Complaints. Everybody wrote a complaint. And the complaint had a title like Lucrece would be one, or Shaw's Wife is another. And they are actually accounts of rapes by monarchs of women. One is, and these rapes are described in various different ways. They're all historical women who were mistresses of monarchs. And they look back and they say, I fell. My virtue was taken by this or that thing. But each writer uses this to wittily do a riff on it and say, this is how the Reformation happened.
This is England. This is England. Yeah.
The woman is the original church. So for some writers, she's the Puritan. She is the pure reformed ideal. This beautiful, the original Christian church is taken over by Constantine and becomes diminished, becomes established. Much later, she's married as a woman now. She is then made the mistress of a king, and that's the English situation. An already damaged church is damaged and ruined, wrecked and killed when an English monarch takes her as his mistress in an adulterous situation. So that's the first one. The next one says, but actually she was pure. She was a pure Catholic figure, and then the church got hold of her. Shakespeare follows all these. There's a whole series of them, each one responding to the last one, saying, no, it wasn't like that. The church was like this. They're arguing about what's happened to the church in England. And Shakespeare produces this masterpiece, The Rape of Lucrece, which covers the entire spectrum of argument that they've had up to then, and tells us exactly what happened in the Reformation.
So I've been dying my whole life to ask you this question, because it's my joy, because I've always thought that equivocation was politicized post-modernity, 400 years avant-garde. People knock on your house, have you got a priest? And there's 5 in the cupboard saying Mass in Latin, and you say no. And you're not lying, because it's a joke. It's a politicized joke. There aren't any priests. That's the whole point. So no, I don't. And you're playing on the subjectivity that exists because everything has been made subjective at the Reformation. It's so incredibly intelligent that only Jesuits could do this, and only Jesuits could do this, and it would be punishable by death. By Elizabeth, it was proven to be the case. So I wanted to ask you, I've always wanted to ask you this question. That's why I'm so animated. So Jesuits came to argue a position known as equivocation, which was in a sense a project of politicizing Shadowplay, in that Catholics could avoid lying to Protestant captors by engaging in a sort of word game, where meaning was left ambivalent towards the truth without having to commit to the sin of false witness. This was so controversial that it was actually banned by Queen Elizabeth, who herself was renowned for enjoying wordplay. So is there a direct link between Jesuitical equivocation and Shakespeare's covert strategy? And he uses the word equivocation quite a lot.
He uses equivocation in McBeth. I think that's the first place he uses it. And it's because it was a cause célèbre, equivocation. It actually started, it was in 1595, so 10 years before the Gunpowder Plot. Robert Southwell was executed. And at his trial, he was asked about this new Jesuit tool, this strategy for not answering truthfully, not under oath, actually, which was a similar issue which the Puritans had. And it led eventually to the First Amendment, or to the equivalent, that people could not incriminate themselves in a court. So the Jesuits recommended that in an extreme situation, you, as you say, you're permitted to play with the truth. And Southwell at trial.
They're still doing it.
Well,
I mean,
Robert Southwell at his trial, when he was asked about this, and Coke, his prosecutor, said, "Look, this actually undermines the law," which is true. If you can say things with your fingers crossed behind your back, you're undermining the law. And Southwell said, "Well, let me give you an instance. If you had the Queen of England upstairs and her enemies came into your room and they said, if the Queen is the Queen here, how would you answer?" And Coke flew into a rage and said, "That's totally different situation. I can't answer that." But actually Southwell...
Well, you've got the King of the World in the Eucharistic Tabernacle. I mean, it's on a higher order.
Yes, but Southwell tried to... Southwell was a Jesuit, and he got Coke on that. No, I mean... Shakespeare seems to attack and denounce equivocation, but he's equivocal.
Oh, does he?
Equivocal.
Oh, I see.
In Macbeth, he can't be. Just after the Gunpowder Plot, he's not going to say equivocation is an excellent thing. And he goes out of his way to say it isn't, because he puts a character who is definitely Henry Garnet in hell. Because in the middle, I don't know if you remember, in the middle of Macbeth, a porter comes on stage. He's drunk. He's the porter of Macbeth's castle. Duncan has just been killed. And Duncan's supporters are banging on the castle door trying to get in. He's too drunk to open the door. But he does say, "Oh, I'm the devil porter in the mystery plays." Everybody knew the devil at the gates of hell when Christ is harrowing hell. Christ's banging on the door and the devil's sort of joking around inside. So, that's who I am. Oh, look who's in hell. Look at all these people. Who are they all? They're all Henry Garnet. He uses Henry Garnet's aliases. Farmer is one to say, here he is. Here is an equivocator who was a traitor to God, who was a traitor for God, but could not equivocate to heaven. Here's an equivocator who was a traitor.
But he's not saying that, is he? He likes the equivocation. He's the lady protests too much. That's sort of what he's doing, isn't it?
I think anyone watching that would say, oh my gosh, he's in hell. That's a scene of hell. This equivocator has just been executed, Henry Garnet, for the gunpowder plot, which no one can defend.
No one can defend.
Oh gosh, Shakespeare's saying he's damned for this, like everybody else.
So he's condemning equivocation, or he supports it?
He's being very, very, very equivocal.
Yeah, I know he is.
in the mystery play, this scene, this is the harrowing of hell. How does it pan out? There are the people in limbo. They're not in deep hell.
No.
The doors of hell open. The next, Christ comes in, and what did he say to the people who are in that part of hell? He says, "Come to me, Adam, my darling."
Yeah.
And he went. So Garnet, who could not equivocate to God, but could equivocate to the crown, Garnet, in the eyes of God, is in heaven. That's what Shakespeare said to people who remember the mystery plays.
I imagine people are laughing at this point as well, because it is basically comedy to play around with words like this, and so that's part of the. It's part of what covers you, is that people find it funny.
No, I don't think so. I think if you scroll back to playing with words, I mean, it's very satisfying playing with words. But in a Soviet situation, playing with words is serious. You've got to get it right, and you've got to say the right thing in the right order and respond correctly. Not laugh, not show you know it. There's all that aspect.
Oh, I see.
It is a game.
It's the opposite. Well. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the game can be fun.
Because of course he writes comedies. That's what I'm trying to say. He does write comedies, so they are funny, but they're also about the context.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it reminds me of the end of The Sound of Music, which is the Catholic Herald's favourite film voted. And of course they're there, aren't they, with their spanners, and they're taking apart the cars. They can't chase the Von Trapp family, and then they're sort of saying we're not. And they cross themselves. And it just strikes me that that's part of the drama, and then she walks into the church as the bride of Christ, and it's very beautiful and everyone loves it. But that's part of the story, as it were. So I always think that's kind of analogous in some way. So, well, we've sort of touched upon this, but it seems to me that there was a certain bravery in Shakespeare when he was actually addressing the true history of his age. Would you agree with that statement? He was brave where other people might not have been.
Yes, I suppose so. I think he knew how clever he was. He was under no illusions there. But I know we're going to perhaps come on to this, is, did he address the monarch?
We're getting to that, yeah.
I think I'm going to skip to this on the bravery one, because this really was brave.
Yeah. I mean, could he have been killed? Would there be a situation where he could have been killed?
Ben Jonson went to prison, nearly died. I think actually that was because he killed someone in a duel. But nearly all his contemporaries. Well, let's take Marlowe, his great contemporary, who was definitely killed he was murdered. Kidd. Thomas Kidd, a great playwright who didn't write very much, he died of torture. So nearly all the playwrights were had up by the Privy Council in some way or other. But Shakespeare didn't, and I think his skill was addressing the monarch directly. So he wrote 3 plays that were definitely targeted at Queen Elizabeth.
Well, I wanted to start sort of building up to Elizabeth, because if we look at a glaring example of Shakespeare's hidden meaning in Macbeth, which is hard really to unsee once you see it. So if I just read from Macbeth, Macduff is crying out on discovering Duncan's body, "Most sacrilegious murder hath broke open the Lord's anointed temple and stolen the life of the building." So this seems to be very clearly about the removal of the Blessed Sacrament. So do you agree that this exclamation really does weigh in favour of your thesis?
Yes, although it's a particular character saying it, so you could say it's that character's take. But I do think that the way he describes the Blessed Sacrament, or the way he describes certain people, certain sacred characters in terms of the Blessed Sacrament, could only come from somebody who had been at some point Catholic. An example is Desdemona. When she arrives on shore, Cassio greets her. She comes out of the storm, and she is a Catholic figure. And you know this immediately because Cassio goes down on his knees and he says, just get this, the rosary. He says, "Yup, hail to thee, lady, and the grace of heaven, and wheel thee round." So this wheeling round of the rosary in a storm. The book describes the Battle of Lepanto, which it refers to, Lepanto connected with the rosary. But he also says about Desdemona this beautiful thing about the Blessed, describes her in terms of the Blessed Sacrament. And he says, she is one who, in the essential vesture of creation, doth tire the ingenia. Now, that's so hard to understand that you have to stop and read it. But what he says, she is one who, in the vesture, the dressing of creation, dresses the ingenia, the creator. So she embodies the creator in the vesture of creation, which is the universe. Now and again, he'll do something like that, which only a theologian maybe could do. Yeah, I think
you say in your book that the sly against the Catholic was that they were gazers.
Yes, that's right, because it's thought by Catholics simply gazing at the Blessed Sacrament when it was lifted, elevated, gave you grace. That was enough. That's why you had holes in the side of churches called squints, so you could see it. Now, the Protestants said it's not a sacrament, you don't get grace from that. And so they thought that was superstitious. So, yeah, that was...
Does Hamlet goes to Wittenberg, is that right? And then he comes back to England and the gravedigger says to him, in England, all the men are crazy as he is. Is that what happens?
He does say, well, all men are as crazy as he, Hamlet. I'm not sure it's the...
Yeah.
Yes, Hamlet's dialogue...
I think there is a reference to Wittenberg there, isn't there? Is that right?
Where he studied. That was university.
There you are. So he comes back to England, the pirate ship and all that. And then the gravedigger is saying to him, in England, all the men are as crazy as he is. I mean, this is just really incendiary. I mean, it's almost brazen.
Well, Wittenberg, Luther's town, as you know, and Horatio was there too. You've got Hamlet moving from... because this is a pre-Essex Rebellion play, Shakespeare's casting his net as wide as possible because Essex's appeal was right across the spectrum. He had a rainbow coalition, if you like, of followers, including, from Catholic right through to radical Puritan. Anybody who wanted religious toleration flocked to his banner. Everyone who wanted to get rid of the regime flocked to his banner. And so we have Hamlet as someone who moves from Lutheran position. He's called by the old Catholic position. He resists it as long as he can.
And it's a tragedy. So, I mean, that's the reality. But that's absolutely fascinating. But it strikes me that perhaps he was more tentatively looking to see what he could get away with at the beginning, maybe something like that. And then as he progressed and with the history as it unfolded with the gunpowder plot and stuff, he was like, I'm going to be much more hesitant now. But perhaps in his youth, he was just a bit more rebellious.
Well, I think he changed his stance every so often. When James came, he wrote appeals to James in a particular James-like way, using King James's books. So James said, oh gosh, I wrote that. So he's going to listen. So he never changes in what he's trying to do, which is to bring in religious toleration. religious coexistence in a Catholic context. Ideally, it usually ends up.
It's humanist, actually, which is the claim that Shakespeare could be reduced to humanism. But I think Catholicism has always encouraged humanism, unlike the Reformation. You know, Thomas More was a humanist in a sense.
Yes, okay, humanism then meant something different. You couldn't be atheist.
Oh no, that's right.
Really,
Yeah.
but Erasmus.
No. But it meant, you know, upholding the values of humans sort of outside of a theological context or indirectly.
Yes, or was it someone who was using classical Greek, Latin, ancient models and trying to integrate them, the humanities, into Catholic theology, if you like?
But Catholicism does engage classical texts, unlike Reformed theology.
You would have an argument with a Reformed theologian on that one, or at least of that
Well,
time.
I mean,
And maybe now that's the case. But then they also were deeply. I mean, they were all children of the Renaissance, and that was when humanism came in. So I think humanism was common to any intellectual, to the whole lot. Love's Labour's Lost is a kind of tribute to humanism.
So let's look at the ending of The Winter's Tale. Is this a social commentary of the Catholic Church under the Reformation?
Well, Winter's Tale, I just had a look at that. It's an astonishing play. The end of it, we mentioned the split between the traditional Catholic faith, which was completely outlawed with vestments, candles, the high old traditional Catholic faith banned. Instead, it was stripped down, and if it existed at all when the Winter's Tale was written, it was underground, it was humbled, it was in the country, it was much simpler, but it still continued, and it had a virtuous and pure identity by then. All the pomp and so on had been stripped out of it. Even the aristocratic houses had been cut down, like the Herberts and so on, and had struggled to retain their Catholicism. So what you have in that play is a huge stretch of time with the old church embodied in Hermione, and she apparently dies. She's gone. And Leontes realizes her husband, like Henry VIII's picture, killed her. And he objects at the end. Did I kill her? And he's told, yes, you did. You killed her. So he accepts that, and but it's not the end.
No, it's a comedy. It's ultimately a comedy.
It's very much like 16th century England. There's a sheep shearing going on. It's a rural, rustic scene. And we get this beautiful girl, Perdita, who's been brought up not knowing that she's actually a princess, as a shepherd's daughter. And she is a personification of beauty, wit, mystical beauty as well. And it's clearly meant to make us feel that this is the reborn spirit which died with Hermione. So,
like the second spring, in a way.
Indeed, yes, you could see it that way. That's right. So then Shakespeare does this extraordinary thing, which he tried to do also in Merchant of Venice, is to reintegrate the old, which has been put in a cupboard. It's been set in aspic. It's stuck. She's a statue, Hermione. Actually, she's survived. But she acts a statue for Leontes to see that, my gosh, was that my wife? And then he realized she's alive. So it's kind of a trick. But it's also a picture of the ossified but beautiful, frozen old religion. And then this dynamic, alive, young, and charismatic new one, which somebody says as she approaches the palace at the end, says, gosh, she could start a new religion if she wants, a new sect. She could start a new sect. Now, Shakespeare doesn't want that to happen. Is this new revived spirituality going to go somewhere else, or can it be reintegrated? There's a huge question at the time, because the Catholic body was split between Catholics who accepted the oath that King James tendered, which was in some ways a less difficult oath for Catholics to take, So Catholics were beginning to say, look, we can be English and Catholic. We can take the oath and be part of public life. So this is perhaps what the predator side. It's the English Catholic with the grand universal Catholic, and this tremendous scene at the end of The Winter's Tale is a sort of wish fulfillment, where mother and daughter embrace, come together, and reintegrate into Shakespeare's constant dream, the reintegration of the traditional and the questioning and reform impulse.
Well, we're doing this at the moment as well in the Catholic Church. So Newman and Tolkien, they're all saying this is the perennial movement of the Church.
It is.
So,
it's fascinating. Winter's Tale shows that he was addressing the same problem. Yeah.
And I think there is, in those cases, explorations of possible hope.
Yes.
It's not just despair. It's there must be a way out of this hellhole.
Well, indeed. I mean, in this case, there was literal political hope. Because when he addressed some plays to the Queen, some to the King, he gave up on the King after the Gunpowder Plot, when persecution began again, and he addressed his son, Henry, who was the coming hope, the future hope. This play was written for his marriage, Winter's Tale. So Henry's about to be married, possibly to someone who's Catholic. And Shakespeare is sort of showing how he can rescue, reintegrate the psyche of the country if he goes ahead with this. And he does it very well.
So, for want of being witty here, I think I can enjoy phrasing it like this. I am dying to hear how you consider Romeo and Juliet to have serious undertones of martyrdom. I am genuinely dying. I think this is the case. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but with the modern retelling of Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Adams, in the poster, it's the Sacred Heart at the top. Behind Romeo and Juliet, it's Saint Therese of Lisieux, who died of a broken heart, martyr of love. And then the whole film is absolutely saturated in Catholic imagery. Sacred Heart, Immaculate Heart, statues of the saints, a Catholic priest, and it's the Sacred Heart is on the gun of suicide. I mean, I always think in The Lord of the Rings as well, at least Peter Jackson's adaptation, Gimli says to march on the gates of Mordor without a chance of winning, that would be suicide. What are we waiting for?
Yeah.
You know? So I've always thought it was like Carmelite mysticism, dying for the sake of like mystical union, but I don't know if that's too far. Because the martyrs were trying to do this.
Romeo and Juliet, it seems, was written for the Earl of Southampton's wedding, which was secret to Elizabeth Vernon. We don't know enough about her, except she was tiny, and she was a cousin of the Earl of Essex, and very likely to have been Catholic, and Southampton was Catholic, of course. So the Queen would have totally disapproved, because Elizabeth Vernon was her lady-in-waiting, one of many. And there's a passage early in Romeo and Juliet where this is mentioned, that I think it's the Queen, the Moon's lady-in-waiting, the Moon being jealous of her lady. So that reference is there. And we know it must be that because Romeo and Juliet, the poem, which predated the play, written by Arthur Brooke, was written for Southampton's mother, I think, her wedding father. And it was a family motif, a family theme. So there it is. Now, Southampton is a very dangerous young man who is part of a group of other dangerous young men, including Essex and many others. He's been appallingly brought up, largely by Lord Burleigh, as a ward of court. And he exemplified the danger of young men who would simply lead a rebellion that would not work against the crown. And tragically, that is what happened. It's what Essex did. A rebellion that didn't have enough popular support. So one thing the play is doing is saying, careful what you do. Make sure you've got a power base. And he does the same with the poem he wrote for Southampton, which is one of the only dedications that is actually there on the page. Venus and Adonis. And there again, Adonis abandons his horse, runs away. He has no power base. So it's don't go it alone. And two people who did go it alone and died were Campion and Marlowe.
Yeah, I
Christopher
see.
Marlowe.
Yeah, there you are.
Those two people have shadowy walk-on parts. They're like little cameos saying, look what happens. So Marlowe, who tried to play a lone hand in the intelligence service game and was a great writer who Shakespeare obviously clearly hugely admired, is Mercutio. And in my book, I show how, when you said how funny the wit is, it is funny. The wit that links Mercutio to Christopher Marlowe. Mercutio is caught in the crossfire of this feud. You're never told quite why the feud is there. He keeps all that fuzzy. You can't say Montague, Capulet is Catholic or Protestant, anything like that. It's a divided state. So in a divided state, it doesn't do to try and go it alone. Same with Romeo, tries to do it, and the same with the Campion. And the nurse's speech, the nurse goes into a long speech, which you look at the book, it's too much to go into here. But it's full of tiny references to Campion and his arrest. And that speech...
But Campion is to be celebrated as a holy person. His martyrdom is a good thing. Is that part of it? Or?
That would be dangerous.
He's a saint.
To say that, then, even to possess the poem which said it, which is called Why Do I Use My Paper, Ink and Pen? It was a ballad about Campion written by Henry Walpole. And it circulated like wildfire. But if you were caught with it, you were in deep trouble because the Campion bag couldn't be mentioned. And this...
But he's on the side of Campion. He's writing about Campion in a positive way as someone that should be celebrated.
I don't know that he really is. One longs for Shakespeare, but one thing he doesn't do, you don't get the Virgin Mary. You would expect if you want to make him a conventional Catholic writer, you'd expect Marian writing. Not that. Admiration of Campion. It's perhaps there in that passage. But really, what comes over more is danger. Is this the right way to go? And in Rape of Lucrece, he asks this question. Isn't martyrdom? What exactly does it achieve? It's the last resort.
But have you seen the modern Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio? Yes. Right. So are they just completely off point? Because it strikes me they've completely understood the story, because ultimately they end up in a church and they immolate themselves on an altar, and as a result of their immolation, peace is restored between warring parties. So martyrdom does bear fruit. It bears significant fruit. It's an altar sacrifice which reestablishes comedy, basically.
Yes.
It's a comedy. I've always thought it's a comedy. I don't think it's a tragedy. I look at it in the light of Carmelite mysticism and say they're opening the door to the transfiguration of these warring partners, like these warring families.
That's true.
Which is a great thing. That's a good thing.
At the end, the families do come together, don't they? And there are statues. Both get a gold statue, yes, which is rather like saints. And there was a poem at the time, or comment at the time. Was it a poem? No, it's a poem at the beginning of the first folio. And it says, Romeo, I think it's a list of Shakespeare characters that seem as saints, although they show not. So they don't look like saints, but they are. So the beauty of Shakespeare, though, is unlike Baz Luhrmann, who did the screenplay of that film, the film of Romeo and Juliet. He is so delicate. And you very often, whether you're talking about the hidden layer or the surface layer, people make it too simple. And the beauty of him is he always sees all points of view at all times. He definitely sees the universal Catholic Church, the Mass, the sacraments, as given by Christ, and he is a deep believing Christian. There's no doubt about that from the way his most elevated theological passages work. And if you read them, perhaps the simplest go-to place is the end of Merchant of Venice, which is the Easter liturgy, done in the most reverent way. and it's presented as a ceremony that connects fallen humanity with God. So there's no doubt that he was.
I will always be struck by that poster chooses Saint Therese of Lisieux for the centerpiece, and she dies a martyrdom of love, which is in some way borderline suicide, but it isn't. And she's saying yes to God as she's dying of love with her heart exploding in fire. And the pretext to the martyrdom, let's say, of Romeo and Juliet, is the speech where they fall in love, which is all the language of Catholicism. It's kissing the relics, it's going to the holy shrines, it's pilgrimage. And for me, there is Marian. That's quite Marian in the sense that the pilgrimages were to Mary. I mean, we're in Walsingham today. That's what we're actually talking about. And it seems like their martyring love is on the altar of sacrifice, and it reestablishes the peace like in a comedy. I could be wrong, but why did they choose Saint Therese of Lisieux, the seculars who wanted to tell the story?
Well, that was them. That's their. I imagine the play, if you read Romeo and Juliet, it's full of religious language. So
Catholic language.
Love is expressed throughout the poem in religious language, spiritual language. As you say, there's the sonnet. When they meet, they speak in a reciprocal sonnet that he's a pilgrim who kisses her hand but wants to kiss more, and so on.
In the context of the saints.
Yeah. Now, if you were Stephen Greenblatt, you would say this is Shakespeare using the evaporating, decaying language of religion, of the Catholic religion.
I see.
And you're recycling it and using it to intensify a normal, secular, if you like, but passionate love affair. So people say, you're divine. It's like that. Mm-hmm. So the Baz Luhrmann film does the opposite. It takes all that imagery seriously and uses it in an inspired way.
I'm glad you're tempering my view, but I'm going to stick by that there must be something latent within the text.
If you imagine that film wasn't there, because it's only one man's view, not Shakespeare's.
I think I just love the film. Yes, anyway, let's move on. I did want to ask you about Queen Elizabeth. We were sort of building up to that. She seems to be referred to as the moon explicitly within Midsummer Night's Dream, which was a phrase directly used by her courtiers. On the face value, again, this seems quite brazen, a kind of precarious strategy, possibly, of directly addressing the regnant monarch. Why did Shakespeare choose to do this? How many examples of direct address do you find to a contemporary monarch? Why was he taking a risk? Is that a risk?
Well, going back to the moon, she was the moon, of course. She was Diana, she was chaste, and all her courtiers played around with the idea that she was this chaste, beautiful Diana, moon goddess. And Walter Raleigh said he was the water and she was the moon.
So just a final question. If you could ask William Shakespeare anything, what would it be?
I'm wondering about that. I definitely will be unhappy if I die and I can't ask him the question, is this all true? Were you really doing it?
Yeah.
Were you doing it?
I think some of your critics have said that, but I would hope to say the case. I'll read you something in your favour. So this is from Cymbeline, and I do want to thank you for today. And I do find this passage haunting in the context of everything we've discussed. From our blessed altars, publish we this peace to all our subjects. Set we forward, let a Roman and a British ensign wave friendly together. Our peace will ratify, seal it with feasts, set on there. Never was a war did cease, ere bloody hands were washed with such a peace.
That's the perfect ending. Thank you.
Good, excellent. Thank you so much, Lady Clare, and we hope to have you on again soon.